Look out the window right now. If it's raining, you probably already feel a little stuck, a little annoyed, maybe already planning to just stay in and wait it out. Now imagine that rain doesn't stop tomorrow. It doesn't stop in 3 days. It keeps going for 2 straight weeks, no roof you can fully trust, no dry firewood, no grocery store, no heater. For most people watching this, a rainy week just means canceled plans. So here's the question. How did ancient humans actually survive that? Not stay dry, not stay comfortable, survive. Because for many parts of the ancient world, weeks of continuous rain wasn't a mood killer. It was one of the most dangerous stretches a person could live through. Let's start with the stranger fact first. Extended rain events weren't rare freak occurrences ancient people rarely dealt with. Depending on where you lived, they were seasonal and expected. Monsoon systems across South and Southeast Asia have reliably dumped weeks of near-continuous rainfall every single year for thousands of years. Parts of the Pacific Northwest and Northern Europe went through long, gray, wet stretches too, though usually a steadier drizzle over weeks rather than monsoon-intensity downpour. Either way, for large portions of the ancient world, extended wet weather was simply what a chunk of every year looked like, which means surviving it wasn't luck. It had to be a repeatable skill, refined and passed down, because getting it wrong wasn't a minor setback. It could be fatal. Here's the actual mechanism behind why prolonged rain was so dangerous. It wasn't really about being wet. It was about what wet takes away from you, one system at a time. Fire is the first casualty. Dry tinder becomes almost impossible to find once everything outside has been soaked for days, and without fire, you lose cooking, water purification, warmth, and protection from predators after dark, all at once. Then there's body heat. Wet skin loses heat far faster than dry skin, even in temperatures that wouldn't be dangerous otherwise, which means hypothermia becomes a real threat even in weather that isn't technically cold. Food gets harder too. Hunting is quieter and less effective in heavy rain, tracks wash away, and stored food is at constant risk of rot and mold in prolonged damp conditions. And stagnant water left behind by weeks of rain becomes a breeding ground for waterborne illness, a genuinely major killer in pre-modern populations. Rain didn't threaten ancient humans with one problem. It threatened them with 4 or 5 simultaneously, all stacking on top of each other the longer it lasted. And it's worth sitting with just how fast that stacking effect could turn dangerous. A single wet night is an inconvenience. A wet week means clothing and bedding never fully dry between uses, which chips away at insulation night after night. A wet 2 weeks means the body is losing the fight against cold and damp slowly, cumulatively, in a way that's much harder to reverse than a single bad night. Immune systems weaken under sustained cold exposure and poor sleep. And it's a plausible extension of that fact, though not something we can point to a specific dataset for, that a lot of the real damage from a rainy stretch shows up afterward, in the exhausted, run-down days once the weather finally breaks. The real danger of prolonged rain wasn't any single moment of misery. It was the slow compounding of small deficits: heat, dryness, food, rest, each one a little worse than the day before, until the body simply couldn't absorb anymore. So how did they actually manage it? Shelter design was the first line of defense, and it was far more sophisticated than people assume. Many ancient groups built shelters with steeply angled roofing specifically to shed water fast rather than let it pool and seep through. A design principle that shows up independently across different cultures and climates, from thatched roofing in Southeast Asia to bark-covered structures in parts of North America. Elevated sleeping platforms kept people up off ground that was often damp or actively flooding. Some groups dug shallow trenches around shelter perimeters specifically to redirect running water away from where people slept, an early, low-tech version of drainage engineering. Fire preservation was treated as seriously as food storage. Rather than trying to start a new fire in soaked conditions, which can be nearly impossible, many cultures focused on keeping embers alive continuously, sometimes for days, banked under ash or carried in fire-resistant containers specifically so a fire never had to be restarted from scratch during a wet stretch. Some groups pre-gathered and stored dry tinder and kindling undercover well before rainy seasons arrived, essentially stockpiling the one resource that becomes hardest to find once the rain actually starts. Food strategy shifted too. Preserved and stored foods, dried meat, smoked fish, fermented or dried grains became critical during long, wet periods when fresh hunting and gathering slowed down. Elevated and ventilated storage structures kept stored food away from ground moisture and mold. In regions where monsoon seasons were a predictable yearly event, entire food systems were built around it. Intense preservation and storage effort in the dry season specifically to survive the wet one that was guaranteed to follow. Social behavior likely shifted too, in ways that rarely make it into the popular imagination of ancient life. Extended rain often meant more time clustered together indoors or under shared cover, and it's a reasonable inference that this reinforced group cooperation and shared labor, since food preservation, fire tending, and shelter repair all work better as coordinated group tasks than solo efforts. Storytelling, toolmaking, and craft work associated with many ancient cultures may well have gotten a boost during long wet stretches, simply because there was less to do outside and more incentive to keep hands and minds occupied indoors. In that sense, weeks of rain weren't purely a threat to be endured. They may have quietly shaped some of the social and cultural rhythms that defined life in wetter regions of the ancient world. But here's where we have to slow down, because this isn't one universal survival story playing out the same way everywhere. Climate and geography mattered enormously. Groups living in genuinely monsoon-adapted regions had generations of accumulated, specialized knowledge and infrastructure built specifically around extended rain. They weren't improvising every year, they were executing a well-practiced system. Groups suddenly hit by an unusually wet season outside their normal pattern were far more vulnerable, since their shelter, food storage, and fire practices weren't built for it. And it would be wrong to suggest ancient rain survival was some universally solved problem. Unusually prolonged or unseasonal wet spells could still overwhelm even well-prepared groups, straining food stores, and raising sickness risk beyond what any single season's system was built to absorb. The systems people built were genuinely good, but not foolproof. Resource access mattered as well. Groups with reliable elevated ground, hardwood for shelter, and stable food surplus had a real survival advantage over groups working with fewer natural resources, the same way it still shapes disaster resilience today. What's striking is how directly this shaped long-term technology and settlement patterns. The pressure of surviving predictable wet seasons is part of what pushed some cultures toward more permanent, better engineered structures rather than purely temporary shelters, since a shelter that only sort of worked once wasn't good enough to rely on every single year. Elevated granaries, drainage channels, and steeply pitched permanent roofing in wet regions weren't decorative choices. They were direct responses to a threat that showed up on a schedule. Over centuries, that pressure fed into increasingly sophisticated architecture, irrigation, and drainage systems, and eventually the kind of infrastructure that makes modern rain a non-event instead of a survival test. So picture an ancient family riding out 2 straight weeks of rain. Embers kept alive under careful watch since the last dry afternoon. Dried and smoked food rationed out by someone who planned for exactly this months earlier. Elevated floors keeping bedding dry while water runs past outside in the trenches they dug themselves. Every single day of that 2 weeks is active management, not passive waiting. Now picture a modern person riding out the same 2 weeks. Lights on, heat running, food delivered to the door, mildly annoyed about canceled plans. Same weather, same duration. Completely different experience, built entirely on infrastructure most people never think about until it fails. That gap is worth sitting with for a second. It isn't that modern humans became better at surviving rain, it's that an entire chain of invisible systems, sealed roofing, powered heating, refrigerated food, waterproof fabric, now absorbs every single one of those ancient threats before they ever reach the person standing under the roof. Take any one of those systems away, a power outage during a storm, a roof that starts leaking, and modern discomfort can escalate towards something closer to the ancient version surprisingly fast, which is itself a quiet reminder of exactly how much daily survival work has simply been moved out of sight rather than eliminated. Neither response is about toughness or softness. It's about what each version of that scenario actually demands. Ancient humans weren't just enduring the rain, they were running an active, coordinated survival system every single day it lasted. One built from fire management, food preservation, and shelter engineering refined over generations. We've simply outsourced almost all of that system to infrastructure that quietly does the work for us now, which is exactly why 2 weeks of rain barely registers as an inconvenience instead of the genuine test of survival it used to be. And that's really the heart of it. It was never really about staying dry. It was about keeping fire alive, food edible, and bodies warm all at the same time for as long as the sky demanded it. Ancient humans didn't get lucky through weeks of rain. They engineered their way through it. One ember, one dried fish, one drainage trench at a time. If this changed how you think about the last time you complained about a rainy week, drop a comment and let me know what part of this survival system you think you'd struggle with the most.